This morning in our Advent season, we turn to one of the great prophets, the prophet Isaiah, and this morning we will read from the 35th chapter. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom. Like the crocus, it shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord, the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you. When we do something wrong or when we make a mistake, whether by accident or intentionally, I think you know what happens within us. We feel the guilt of that choice. There is something that also happens within the body, not simply within the mind. The heart begins to beat faster as we consider what we have done. Sometimes even in the midst of that wrangling, in the midst of that feeling of guilt, we feel the sweat upon our brow and we feel our hands becoming clammy. There is a mental, psychological reaction to doing something wrong, and there is also a physical response to the choice that we make. I remember one very, very clearly from my childhood. It was one summer, and my brother and I, we used to often spend time with a family friend, two kids who are our age, and often we would go to their home, and one day we came up with a game. This family, they had a big dog, a large German Shepherd, and there was a tent in the backyard, and we used to play with the dog. We would stand with the dog at one side of the yard, and we would all run to the tent, and the dog would come chasing after us. And when we jumped into the tent, we would wait, and certainly this big dog would come bounding into the tent. I had this idea, this spontaneous idea, that it might be funny if when we ran and when we jumped into the tent, if I closed the zipper. Well, that's what I did. We all ran, jumped into the tent. I pulled down the zipper, thinking this was a great idea. This dog was so big and so large that he crashed into the tent, broke through the zipper, now destroying the opening of the tent. I looked at what I had done, and I was horrified that I had ruined this tent. But we continued to play, and this was nagging, this was gnawing away at my mind, and I went home that afternoon thinking, I have done something terrible, but I couldn't quite tell my mom or our friend's mom what I had done. The summer went on, and I carried this guilt within me. And after some time, we were back over at our friend's house, and I decided it was time. I had to say what I had done. And so I said to our friend's mom, I'm very, very sorry, but last month or whenever it was, I pulled this zipper down and your big dog crashed through the tent, and I have ruined your tent. And I was waiting nervously. I can remember it now. My hands are becoming clammy remembering it. I can feel my heart beating a little faster. And our friend's mom said, the tent? That old tent? We don't even use that anymore. All of the burden that I had been carrying was suddenly moment of assurance, that moment that it's okay. It's okay. There is no problem here, no problem at all. What a relief, what a release, what a peace of mind that came over me. There's a very famous novel called Crime and Punishment, written by the Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky. It's the story of an impoverished student whose name was Raskolnikov. Raskolnikov had this idea, much like perhaps zippering the tent, he had this idea that certain people were above the law because of their greatness. And he decided, if I murder this particular pawnbroker in his neighborhood, he knew that she had a lot of money. He said, if I murder the pawnbroker and take that money, I'll no longer be poor, I'll be able to pay my tuition, and then I can become a great man and do great things in this world. And so that's what he did. He murdered the pawnbroker, he took the money, but you know what happened? Instead of feeling like, now I can do great things, a sense of guilt swept over him. I imagine his hands became clammy. I imagine his heart began to beat faster. The story unfolds with this guy becoming increasingly racked with guilt. He wanders through the city as a haunted man, knowing that he has done something horrific. The police know, they come to understand that he's the one. But the main character of the story, he shirks responsibility until finally he reaches that moral breaking point. And he confesses his crime, that yes, he is the murderer. And so he is sent to prison for 8 years in the story. And when he is released from prison, there is a friend who was dear to him, and this friend takes him in, and he begins that process of experiencing a kind of forgiveness, even in spite of what he had done. A forgiveness and a relief that occurred with his confession. There is something in the Bible, very, very important idea within the Bible, that accountability is critical in our lives. It is important for us to take responsibility for the things that we do, particularly for the bad choices that we make, for the mistakes that we make, for the actions that we perform, whether by mistake or intentionally. There is this keen theme that runs through the course of the scriptures, in which accountability will then be followed by the release that comes with confession and the release that comes with forgiveness. Sometimes people have the feeling that when Jesus comes into the world, it's simply about judgment. Sometimes there is this idea that when Jesus comes, it's going to be a terrible, terrible day. That the advent of Jesus Christ is one in which God executes judgment upon the world. Unfortunately, that perspective, fortunately, that perspective is only one-sided. Yes, Jesus will come into the world and there will be accountability. There will be accountability for the mistakes that are made, for the bad choices that have been made. Yes, but the no of judgment is always, always followed by the yes of forgiveness. In Jesus Christ, we see the judgment of God upon the brokenness of the world, but in that very same Jesus, we see the forgiveness that comes from God. Much like the forgiveness that my friend's mom offered to me about that crazy tent. And this is what Isaiah is pointing to. And this morning, I would really like to focus on verses 3 and 4. At the beginning of the week, I thought I was going to focus on the first two verses, which are powerful and filled with imagery. But I'd like to focus, in light of this experience of judgment and forgiveness, I'd like to focus on verses 3 and 4. The Lord, through the prophet Isaiah, says, "Say to those who are of a fearful heart, be strong, do not fear. Here is your God. He will come with vengeance, with terrible recompense. He will come and save you." What is Isaiah talking about here at this moment? Isaiah, who has a keen sense that the Messiah, of this Messiah who is to come, understands that with this Messiah, there will be judgment. Isaiah says he will come with vengeance and with terrible recompense. This coming Messiah is going to pronounce judgment upon all of those who have sought to harm the people of Israel. But this coming Messiah is also going to hold God's people accountable. However, it's so important to hear the final sentence in this reading. He will come and save you. So often in this world, we are accustomed to judgment. So often in this world, we are accustomed to punishment, to rejection. So often in this world, it is tempting for us to pronounce judgment upon those around us without generosity of spirit. But you see, God does pronounce judgment upon the things that are counter to the goodness of God and the ways of God. Yes, God does say no to that. But ultimately, God says no to be followed by that divine yes. God calls us out, if you will. But in that calling out for the actions that we have performed, God releases us from that burden that we carry, and God says, "I will save you. I will forgive you. I will set you free." And that is the Advent promise, that this light that is coming into the world is a light that will dispel darkness. You might think about the dispelling of darkness is a judgment upon darkness. In this world, we feel and we sense darkness all around us. Sometimes we contribute to that darkness because of our limited nature. Sometimes we see that darkness encroaching upon us. But the light that is coming is a light that will push the darkness away. And that is the judgment of God. God brings forth light into the world to say no to darkness. And what happens when the light shines, when the darkness goes away? There is new life. There is beauty. You know, in the far north, up in those Arctic lands, the north of Alaska, northern Scandinavia, there comes a time around the end of the year in January when there is only darkness. The sun does not rise for about 25, 28 days. total darkness, 24 hours a day for a month. Can you imagine what that must feel like? But then the sun returns. Then the light is dispelled, and once again, light shines upon those Arctic lands. In many ways, we can feel as though we are living in a very similar situation with darkness all around us. Sometimes we even feel that we are carrying an all-encompassing darkness within us, like myself, with that summer tent long ago, or like Raskolnikov in the novel. We can feel not simply a darkness around us, but we can feel a darkness within us. The good news here is that the darkness will be dispelled. And perhaps that carries us back to the beginning of this chapter. The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. What was dark shall become light. What was deadened will be brought to life and to be fruitful. The old will be transformed and something new will emerge in its place. The burdens that we carry, the living God is saying, yes, yes, you need to deal with that burden. You need to acknowledge what you have done. But God says, like a parent who loves you unconditionally, but God says, yes, you have done something wrong. And we all have, whether in childhood or adulthood, we all have. God says, yes, you have. But God does not leave us in that state of despair. God says, now I will forgive you. And what a joy it is to have that burden that we acknowledge, that burden taken from us. We are like the wilderness that shall be glad. We become like the desert that shall rejoice and blossom. We are like the crocus, that bulb within the winter soil. We are like the crocus that shall blossom abundantly. This is what God will do. This is what God is doing even now. And this is the new reality of which Isaiah speaks. The darkness may seem to be all-encompassing. The light of God pronounces judgment upon that darkness and scatters it and replaces it with brilliance. The darkness within our hearts causes us perhaps guilt within our minds. It causes us to have sweaty palms and a heart that is beating faster. But we are relieved. We are relieved of that burden, that guilt, that regret, that shame. We are relieved of that. It is taken away because the judgment of God is followed by the forgiveness of God. If you hear someone just pronouncing a word of judgment, they only have half the story, and when you have half the story, it becomes a destructive message. We need to understand both accountability and forgiveness. We need to understand that there is bondage and there is liberation. We need to understand that we who have been far away are now brought home, that we who have been cast out, we are now welcomed. This is the good news that Isaiah delivers. This is the good news, so that like a kid who breaks a tent can experience that forgiveness, like any of us who have done something wrong and can experience forgiveness. This is at the very heart of the scriptures. And this is at the very heart of the Advent message. And this is what ultimately will make Christmas so so beautiful and so miraculous that God does not abandon the world in our darkness, but that God comes to the world in light. And in coming in this light, the darkness is cast out, and a new world begins to shine, so that indeed the wildernesses of our own making now can blossom with life, so that the dry lands can be fruitful, and so that we, like a crocus planted deep within the ground, shall now blossom abundantly. Amen.